The next thing that we need to add is this area here that contains the text. And then, of course, this image slider over here towards the right. Now, there's quite a bit to do to the image slider in terms of adding these buttons. That's something that we'll worry about in another movie. For right now, what we want to do is get this article text to appear the way that we want it to. And we also want to add this border that you see down here. If you come over and choose the zoom tool, if you zoom into this area, you'll notice that it's a dotted line. And that can easily be reproduced using CSS. Again, if you want to use the HTML5 semantic-based tags, article would be a good option for this content right here. Nevertheless, what we want to do is come back to our HTML editors, and inside the HTML editor, we need to add the HTML structure so we can add that content. So inside the main hello div, we want to add a new div element. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a new div element, not fiv, but div. And we want to use a class attribute. And the class attribute that we want to use is one that's called article. That's one that we'll be working on in just a bit. But then we also want to use C2, which is a class that's part of the F2FW framework. So we'll take a look at that in greater detail in just a bit. But then we also want to use the CF, the clear float class as well. So I'm going to go ahead and close this div element off. Inside of this article element, we have two pieces of content. We have the text, which is the excerpt, which is what I'm going to call it. And then we also have the slider. So we want to set up two more div elements. So the first div element will have a class attribute. And we're going to go ahead and create a class within our CSS called excerpt. So we want to go ahead and type that in. The other thing that we want to do is we want to add a C21 class. And again, we'll take a look at that. It's part of the F2FW framework. So go ahead and plug that in. So after doing that, adding the excerpt and the C2C1 class, you want to make sure to close off this div element. And then we want to add one more div element. And this div element is going to have a class of slider. And then it's going to use the C22 class that's part of the F2FW framework. And then, of course, we want to close that tag off. So we have a little bit to do in terms of research to figure out exactly what these classes are that we're using from the F2FW framework. So let's go ahead and save the HTML document and come back over to style.css. What we're going to do is we're going to perform a find and replace command so we can review what these classes are doing for us. So go ahead and use the keyboard shortcut Control F. It would be Command F on the Macintosh. I'd like you to type in C2 and then click Find Next. And when you do, you'll notice it's grouped with a couple of different classes here. But specifically, what we want to look at is the C2 class that applies the display property and sets it to block. So if you click Find Next again, we'll eventually get to the one that we want to look at. I want to continue to click Find Next, and here we go. So here's C2, and the display property is set to block. Of course, it's grouped with other classes, so it's a compound selector, so to speak. What we want to do next is take a look at the C21. So I'm going to go ahead and change this find to C21. Then I'm going to click Find Next, and you'll notice it brings us here, which is a float left property. And if we were to continue to look at this, we would also see that it has a width property of 49%. And then, of course, C22 is very similar, except it has a float right property. So let's go ahead and just quickly take a look at that. Here's the float right. And it, too, has a width property of 49%. If you continue to find next, here you'll find C22, and it does have that width property set to 49%. So now that you have a better understanding as to what these classes are doing, and again, you certainly could write the CSS yourself in order for you to apply these floats and these width properties, but because it's part of the F2FW framework, we might as well take advantage of it and not rewrite it. So what we want to do next is deal with that border. If we come back to Photoshop for a second, we have this dotted border down here towards the bottom. So let's come back to our CSS file, and I'm going to scroll down here towards the bottom. Down here towards the bottom, I'm just going to create a hello selector. So I'm going to put that up top here just so it's organized a little bit better. And inside this hello selector, what we want to do is we want to add a border bottom property. So if you have code hinting, feel free to use it. What we want to do is set a 1 pixel border, And instead of it being a solid type, it's actually going to be dotted. And the color is going to be D2, D2, D2. So it should be a bluish color. It looks like I have one too many D's in here, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. And that's what it should look like. It's a bluish gray. So we're all set there. We just want to add some padding and margin attributes. So go ahead and type in padding. What we want to do is basically add 25 pixels of padding at the bottom. So shorthand notation says it'll be 0, 0, 25 pixels, and then 0 again. And then we want to do something similar with the margin. So I'm going to go ahead and type in margin. And here I'm going to do the same thing. 0, 0, 25 pixels, and 0. So that looks pretty good. What we want to do next is work on the text that's going to appear inside of the article element. And again, if we take a look at the PSD file, we have a heading, and we also have some text here, some paragraph elements. So let's go ahead and create the styles for this, and then we'll go ahead and add the text to the HTML document. So I'm going to scroll down here, and down towards the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and create a selector that targets the hello ID. In there, we're looking for div element with the article class applied to it, and then more specifically, we're looking for the H2 element. Within the H2 element, we need the text to appear in a certain way. So we're going to go ahead and type in font using shorthand notation. We're going to go ahead and set the type to normal. We're going to set the font size to 25 pixels with 33 pixels of line space. Then we need to set the font family, which is going to be Marvel. And again, at this point, we haven't worked with the @FontFace declaration. We will get there. Arial will be a backup, and so will sans serif. So we're successfully creating our font stack. The next thing that we want to do is essentially the same thing, but we want to do it now for the paragraph element. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this rule, Command-C or Control-C on a Windows machine. I'll go ahead and paste it, and I'm going to update the H2 to a P, and then we want to change the font around a little bit. We don't want it to be set to 25 pixels, but rather 14 pixels and 23 pixels of line spacing. But the font family and the type will all be the same. The other thing that we want to do is we want to set the color, and we're going to set the color to a hex code of #777, which is a darker gray. So I think we're in pretty good shape here in terms of the CSS. What we really need to do now is add some content to the HTML document. So in order for us to do that, honestly, I'm just going to come over and copy the content from Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and tab over to Photoshop. I'm going to find the H2 element. If we take a look at the div article folder, or layer group, I should say, inside the layers panel, we'll see div excerpt, and inside there we see the two pieces of text. I'm just going to go ahead and choose the text tool and copy this text so I don't have to type it in again. With it selected, you can go to the edit menu and choose copy. Then you can come back into Dreamweaver or whatever HTML editor that you're using. Inside index, we have our excerpt. And of course, we want to add an H2 element here. So let's go ahead and do that. So here's the H2. I'm going to paste that text and close off the H2. Then I want to add a paragraph element. So I'm just pressing return, just kind of indenting this code in a way that makes it a little bit easier to read. You may even want to break the H2 element down to the next line. Not like that, of course. I'll just move this over. There we go. So after this H2 element, we want to open up a paragraph element. I'll just close it before I forget. I'm going to return back to Photoshop, and I'm going to select this second paragraph. And with the text tool, I'm just going to copy all of this text to the clipboard, Command-C or Control-C. Then you can come back to your editor, and inside this paragraph element, you can paste that text. Now all you have to do is save the HTML document. Just ensure that your style sheet file was saved, and take a look at it in a web browser. Now, it's not going to be perfect right away. We need to add some space here, which will naturally occur when we add the 3 buttons. And of course, we need to add the slider element over here on the right. But as you can see, we were pretty successful in reproducing this text section within the HTML document based upon this PSD file. So in the next movie, we're going to take it a step further, and we're going to look at how we can get our slider element to look the way that we want it to look. And of course, we also have to deal with these 3 buttons down here below the text.